We really have a lot to push back against with this toxic trafficking narrative because it's just so hard for a lot of people to believe that a person, especially a woman, would ever consent to having sex with someone they don't know, or for money, or, shaking their ass on stage, or what. It's just like people lack imagination, and it's super sexist, in my opinion, to think that a woman or a person couldn't choose to do that.
Savannah Sly, thank you so much for being here with me today.
It's awesome to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
I'm really curious to know about your start in the adult industry. How did that come about?
I was 18 and I was going to art school in Boston, and I was working part-time for minimum wage. I couldn't really earn more money for myself. I couldn't even buy my art supplies. And I discovered Craigslist, and a friend had suggested that I could sell some furniture or something, or like hustle for some money on Craigslist, and I found the adult services section, and I had no preconceived ideas about entering the adult industry. In fact, when I first opened that adult listing section, I was pretty judgmental. I was scrolling through, and I was a photography major, and I'm like, these photographs are terrible. I was just being very judgmental, but obviously kind of curious. And then I saw an advertisement that said, "Sex for money is illegal, work in erotic services." And they were looking for people to work in fetish and fantasy. I didn't know what that was, but I'm like, that's intriguing. And topless massage, which is very clear. I didn't know what a happy ending was. But so I was so naive. I called the number, left my real name, and within a few days I was being interviewed to do erotic massage. And on my very first day, I was being trained by a woman who was slightly older than me, and she was showing me how you set up for an erotic massage. And she's like, we put down a towel and some tea lights, we play some music, they come in, we give them a back rub, we take our tops off, and I'm like, right, gotcha, tops off. And then she's like, and then we flip them over, and we give them a hand job, and I was like, whoa, we what? And she's like, we give them a hand job. And I was like, I felt this terrible feeling in the center of my chest. And I said, I can't do that. And she's like, oh, you can't? Well, why not? And I said, I'm not a prostitute. And she sat me down and she said, you don't have to do anything you don't want to, and you can absolutely leave if you'd like. But I have to ask her, are you a virgin? And I said, no. And she's like, well, has it always been with the same person, or for love, or serious? And I was like, definitely not. And she said, okay, well, again, you don't have to do anything you don't want to, but I suggest you try this. And I decided to try it, and my heart was pounding the entire time until our customer walked through the door. And then it was just flow state, and I did it with this woman who was training me, and it was so easy. And when he left, I remember the first thing I remember as the door was closing behind him was, I feel like a healthcare provider, which is sort of a simplistic, I was 18, I'm like, I just did a good thing for somebody and they really needed that. And then that person had left all the money on the counter, which is not a whole lot of money at the time, but my duo partner took it all, and she opened up the adjoining hotel room, which is where our manager and the other girls were, and she handed all of our cash to our manager. And then he decided how much we got from that. And so I got handed somewhere between $60 and $80. And I just remember holding that money and being like this much money for that? Like, I am in, like, let's do it again. And I just got really fascinated by sex work, and was able to pay for my art supplies and pay my rent. And that was how I got started. But I entered very naively, not knowing what a happy ending was.
How long do you think that session lasted, from what you can recall?
1 hour.
1 hour?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And it went by very quickly.
So much more than what you were making?
I was making $6.50.
Okay.
And so I made more than 10 times that amount in an hour, doing something that I thought was pleasant and lovely, and a good service for somebody who needed touch or affection, or they were stressed out.
What was Can you remember what that first client was like the demographic?
I believe that he was in his 40s. He was a cisgendered male. I'm pretty sure he was non-white, and I never saw him again.
Okay.
And that was a long time ago. But he was very nice.
In your 18-year-old mind at the time then, was there ever any kind of like judgment, or were you maybe even wondering like why was he there?
No, the only judgment that I had was when I was looking at the ads and then my initial reaction to learning what a happy ending was, and my own judgment of myself as to whether I was the kind of person who would give a happy ending or ever be on these adult sites. And I've had that same terrible feeling in the pit of my chest right here every time I've tried a different sex work modality. So the first time I went to a strip club, it's like I felt awful the entire way there and then in the locker room, and it wasn't until I started dancing that it just all goes away. And what I've learned is that I have that feeling up until I start, and then it never comes back. And what I think that feeling is societal judgment. I'm about to cross a bright red line, you know, where you become a whore and there's no going back. And I think there's so much societal conditioning. Even when I was a very experienced sex worker, like the first time I tried performing in porn, I had that same exact feeling because it's just a new red line that you're crossing each time.
Wow. So what about your upbringing then? What were you taught about sex and sexuality prior to your experience when you were 18?
That's a great question. I had a very fortunate, wonderful upbringing. I was raised by two parents who loved me and wanted to have me. They described themselves as ex-hippies. They're musicians and artists and not shy about sex. It was very utilitarian, I think. Like, when I started my period, I told my mom, and she's like, well, let's go get you some supplies, you know? And I remember when I first started dating, when I was around 16, my mom talked to his mom, and they decided that they wanted to make sure that we knew how to use condoms. So I was watching TV, and I was so mortified. My mom came in, and she had a banana and a condom, and she showed it to me, and I was like, are you serious? And she's like, I just need to know. And he's doing it right now with his mom, too, you know? And so I was like, happy. She's like, okay, we don't need to talk about it again, but you can talk to me. It was very open. And also in my high school, we got to have sex education. I've been very fortunate to go into school systems in Maryland and Vermont, respectively, where in kindergarten, I remember we were learning literally about birds and bees, and I remember seeing paper cutouts of like dogs mating, and it's like they're making a baby, and that's about the extent of it. And they're like, humans make babies too, you know, but they didn't. There was no image. And then in fourth grade, we had something a little more scientific, which was about the sperm and the egg, and we watched a video of a woman giving birth. Mm-hmm. And then in high school, we had sex education, learning about the whole process, and learning about contraception options. And also in high school, I became aware that Planned Parenthood exists. I had girlfriends who would go, and you're just in the bathroom talking. And so when I became sexually active, I got to go as a teenager to Planned Parenthood, and I got birth control, and I was able to access free condoms, which was great because I had no money.
I think I am still scarred by the birthing video. Do you remember?
It was shocking.
Rolling out the VCR and the TV, and yeah.
It was really gory.
I don't know if that has evolved since that time.
I don't know. I mean, it's cool to see it. You know, I've only ever seen a woman give birth once in person. I'm proud of educational systems that can show us things like that because they are literally life and death, you know, and it is a really primal graphic process. And I love that it's not sanitized into like, and then they just pop out a baby, you know? It's like, no, it's like this gaping thing and there's ripping and blood and screaming.
Yeah.
It's like, that's what it is.
Actually, whenever I gave birth, they gave me the option to have a mirror in front of me, and I said yes.
Wow.
But then I had them immediately take it away because I was like, oh my God, I can't believe that's happening right now.
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah. That's really cool that you got to see that.
Yeah. So then a very well-rounded foundation then as far as your sexual education, and it sounds like there was a lot of support then as far as from your parents.
From my parents, from other parents around me. I did have friends who came from more conservative religious families, and they did not. I had friends whose parents would sign them out of class and not watch the birthing video. And they would try to get me to come with them, be like, we're not going to watch this stuff. This is gross. It's smutty or whatever. And I'm like, well, actually, I'm going to watch it because it seems like natural. So there was that, but it was a pretty progressive place that I got to grow up in. And also another thing that I like to say is I was encouraged to fully be myself, to be a weird little kid. I was a total tomboy. I was never, there was never any gender expectation put on me by my parents or my school system or anyone else in my life, really. And then I was very fortunate throughout my youth to never experience a sexual assault or molestation, which was not the case for most of my friends. I was very aware of that from like elementary school, that could happen, and it could still happen, you know, but I like to say those things because sex workers have such vast and varied backgrounds, and there's a stigma that to be a sex worker, to enter sex work, you must have been manipulated as a young person, you must have toxic gender stereotypes put on you, or maybe you were abused. And that is the case for some people, but it wasn't the case for me. I do count myself really fortunate to have such a positive upbringing, but I don't get the opportunity to talk much about how I think that positive upbringing gave me what I need to make really smart decisions about my safety and well-being as a sex worker. I think that my analysis of my upbringing and how it has benefited me in sex worker has been a result of having to reflect on the stigmas that we're operating in as sex workers, and then as a sex worker rights advocate, having people question my worldview and my view on my own life. People sometimes believe that women are operating with a false consciousness, like, oh, you're going to really regret this in a few years, just you wait. It's like, I'm still waiting to regret it, you know, it's still really good. Or people think like you must have been abused as a child because you don't know that this is really harming you. And so I think that's where I've gotten that desire to look at my own upbringing, but also I do know a lot of sex workers and just women and people who are not sex workers who have experienced abuse, who have grown up in very like gender segregated cultures, and they are still fully capable usually of making safety decisions for themselves once they get out of that environment, when they become an adult, especially if they get access to community or information, or if they get their own new framework to look at their upbringing and maybe decide to live their own way differently.
Let's transition over then into your work in sex worker advocacy and activism.
Sure.
How did that come about? Did you know somebody who was already engaged in activism at the time?
I didn't. I think the background to my advocacy and why I'm so dedicated to it is I was impacted by the criminal justice system as a young person. When I was in 8th grade, the FBI raided my family's house, where I actually currently live in Vermont, and they took all of our belongings and harassed my mother, and my father was on a work trip, and that was when I learned, when we got raided, that my father grew and sold marijuana. And that's how my artist parents were able to provide a middle-class upbringing for my brother and I, is they were selling marijuana. And that's why we were getting raided. For a moment, I was really angry at my parents that we were being raided, and I was understanding why. But then I saw these FBI agents trashing our house and taking all of our belongings and putting them in boxes, and then smiling at me while I was sitting on the couch, and I'm like, you're the problem, you're attacking my family. My parents are not bad people. But as a young person, my dad went to prison for like 4 years because of that. And we were in rural Vermont, and we had to be very quiet about it. We didn't want the stigma of being like a druggie family. So it's like I got to grow up understanding the effects of prohibition, what stigma feels like associated with criminality. And then also I started smoking pot not too long after that, and I'm like, this is not a big deal. Like, this is insane. And I learned about the war on drugs. So that was like my background, and I wasn't an activist as a teenager. I didn't know what to do. After I was an established sex worker, I'd been a sex worker for maybe almost 10 years. I moved to Seattle, and I discovered sex work community for almost the first time. And it was a SWAP chapter. SWAP is the Sex Worker Outreach Project. They still exist, but they've been one of the only sex worker rights groups in the country sometimes for a while. And there was a local chapter in Seattle, and I was just so excited to meet these other sex workers who were just getting together once a month and having brunch. It was just a community group. And I was just like, I'll host a brunch, let's have a clothing swap. I was just really energized by it. And then shortly after that, we started seeing big headlines in like the Seattle Times about sex trafficking, and we're going to raid all these brothels, and this is all exploitation. And I very naively thought, oh, these people are afraid of the sex industry. They've probably never met sex workers. I'm just going to go to one of these public forums and kind of, I'll go with my friends and we'll be like, we're sex workers, and sometimes things are bad and scary, but let's talk about this because it's not all sex trafficking. And we went to one of these public forums, and it was just so swiftly apparent that A, we were not welcome, B, we were seen as monsters for speaking up against this, kind of what I learned to be propaganda. And very quickly, they took down our local website, the review board, which was a tightly knit community where a lot of people depended on finding clients and networking. A lot of brothels were raided, which was mostly just apartments in Bellevue where women from Asia were working. And they can be a vulnerable demographic for sure, but we had connections to them through like our review board. And there was no sex trafficking found, just all these allegations of sex trafficking, all these headlines. And then laws were starting to get introduced, and there was more police and surveillance and stings where they would arrest hundreds of men in like a weekend. And some of my clients were arrested and put into John's School, which is like re-education camp where they trot out people with terrible victimization experiences and say, this is what you're doing, you're causing this harm and exploitation. And to me, it was just like the war on drugs all over again. Like all drugs are terrible and bad and lethal, like it's like, no, a lot of it is marijuana. It's like there is no such thing as sex work. It's all exploitation. And I got so angry. And I'm still angry. I have always felt with advocacy, that was about 13 years ago, I feel compelled. I cannot stand by and let narratives like that start to affect my communities, affect my clients, and shape, laws. So that's how I got started.
Because these were women in particular that you really cared about, through these breakfasts and these meetups, you really developed community and you got to know them as a person.
Yeah, 100%, and I'm still friends with them. They're the people I live with in Seattle. They are my closest friends. Also, being a sex worker showed me how wonderful female friendship can be. As a tomboy, I mostly had guy friends, and I just wasn't really interested in hanging out with women as much because I just didn't feel like the overlap in interest was there, which is a little silly. It just was that way. But through sex worker community, I got to really love having female friends, and then I discovered people of other genders as well. Sex work was also, as a white girl from Vermont, I had a lot to learn about like different walks of life, and so I just was making all these wonderful connections. And yeah, our business was being tampered with, but also the mental health ramifications of being surveilled and talked like about this in the media. One of my close girlfriends who was deeply disabled with an invisible disability, she was a sex worker, high anxiety individual, can't hold down a normal job. Sex work was how she supported her kid. When they raided our website, the review board, they would scroll on the website and they would click the ads and open them and run them on television. And she was local to Seattle. She was very under the radar. She didn't show her face, but they picked, like, her ad was one of those ads that they showed on television. Okay. And she had a total mental health breakdown and committed herself for like a month and totally exited sex work and entered into low-paying jobs where she struggled. And it was just like she was one person who wasn't even arrested, but it just demonstrated so plainly the harms of trying to like regulate and police our industry in this way.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Whenever this was happening, around what year was it? Do you remember?
This was around 2010, I want to say, 2011.
Okay. So what was the dialogue like then within your community? Like, were you able to give each other the heads up whenever things were happening, or?
We couldn't because this was such a new thing for us. It's like, it was mostly escorts and erotic massage, and I'm a pro dom, and I kind of do a little bit of everything, but it had been operating in relative peace for a while, and there used to be big social meet and greets where clients could meet providers, and you could determine if you wanted to hang out more later. So there was like a real scene, and it was quiet and underground, and we were really caught off guard by this wave of surveillance and criminalization and like propaganda narrative. And so we were just responding, we were reacting, and Swap Seattle was there, and we started doing a whole lot more than just brunches, We started hosting our own public forums, and we started like going to the state capitol and just like marching around Congress, like with flyers saying this is bad and we're angry and we're sex workers, knowing nothing about the legislative process, talking to the media, knowing nothing about media training, and then just trying to talk to anyone who would listen to say this is wrong and it's hurting us, and this narrative is just really stigmatizing and harmful. So we got really busy with Swap Seattle for a couple of years, just trying to push back on this narrative.
So from 2010 and looking forward to circa now, we're in 2024.
I think so, yeah. It's wild.
How do you feel like that the role of stigma has evolved then when it comes to sex work? Do you think that there is generally more awareness about the fact that stigma is so infused or synonymous with sex work even now?
I think that sex work is always going to suffer from stigma, just like sex is going to suffer from stigma. Abortion will probably always suffer from stigma. Non-conventional forms of relationships or sex will probably always suffer from stigma because there just seems to be a certain segment of the population that is icked out by it or think it's morally wrong. So I think that that's always going to be something to contend with. I think that things have changed considerably and for the better because this toxic sex trafficking narrative, which really has nothing to do with the actual issue of exploitation in the sex trade. It just sort of co-opted it to try and eradicate prostitution in general. Sex workers have been responding to that around the world, and especially here in the US, which is sort of ground zero for this narrative. And I think that by sex workers mobilizing, starting their own local groups, their own nonprofits, talking to the media, forming collectives, and writing and expressing themselves, they are asserting their human rights, their right to exist, saying that they shouldn't be pariahs, and they're doing their own destigmatization work. And I think that sex workers are really great at that because they're good at connecting with people generally. And then I think, of course, we've had the pandemic and we've had the rise of online platforms such as OnlyFans and things like that. And now it's pretty common to meet people who know sex workers, and they might be online sex workers and that might be the extent of their modality. And certainly there are different judgments cast against different modalities of sex work and the people who do those. Sometimes we call that the hierarchy. Yes. And so society practices the hierarchy. We try and dismantle it internally in our own communities so we're not judging each other. But those stigmas run deep, and I think that sex workers are leading the way on treating people all with kindness and dignity, regardless of how you make your money in the industry. So I think that we're doing a good job, but we really have a lot to push back against with this toxic trafficking narrative because it's just so hard for a lot of people to believe that a person, especially a woman, would ever consent to having sex with someone they don't know or for money or, shaking their ass on stage or it's just like people lack imagination, and it's super sexist in my opinion to think that a woman or a person couldn't choose to do that.
Let's talk about New Moon Network. Can you tell me what that is and also how that came about?
Sure. New Moon Network is largely a philanthropic organization, but we also are involved in sex worker rights advocacy. Our entire goal is to advance the rights and welfare of people in the sex trade, be them sex workers or survivors of exploitation. And so we have 3 buckets of work. Our first bucket is to create tools that are broadly useful to the movement for sex workers' rights. And so we have programs like Spokes Hub, where we met, where we're trying to offer education to individual advocates so they don't have to learn the hard way like we did when we were just like running around the Capitol yelling at people, which is also kind of effective.
That's kind of cool too,
A
though.
lot of media attention, but we didn't know how a bill became a law. So we're trying to offer that kind of education. We are creating information directories. So we call that capacity building, where we're trying to help advocates and groups be more effective and efficient with their time and resources to achieve their goals. Our second bucket of work is in regranting. So we offer funding to sex worker and survivor-led groups around the country. It's usually micro grants between $1,000 and $5,000. We have given some $50,000 grants for major infrastructure projects like the Sex Worker Community Support Line run by Swap Behind Bars. So we see that as a direct service that's national and serves anybody in the sex trade. And there's nothing else like that. So we really invest in that. So we do regranting. We have a small but mighty fund. And then our third bucket of work is to try and get more philanthropic dollars into the movement for sex workers' rights. So either through New Moon to grow our fund, and we as an intermediary will disperse that funding, or we help sex worker groups write grants, or we try and identify opportunities like government contracts for certain public health projects, or introducing high net worth individuals directly to sex worker advocacy groups so that they can fund them directly. So we spend a lot of time in philanthropic spaces trying to educate philanthropy on why they can't overlook sex workers' rights. If you care about women's rights, immigration, racial justice, by overlooking sex workers' rights, we're not going to make solid gains. Like, it's not a surprise to me that we're seeing abortion rollbacks when people like me can't even choose the conditions under which I have sex, right? It's like, of course I don't have control over my uterus. I don't have control over my sex life, right? It's all criminalized. So that's not shocking to someone like me, but explain to philanthropists that we will have more solid gains if we include sex workers.
What is the general response that you get whenever you are in these rooms and talking to these philanthropic organizations and trying to educate them?
Well, people are always interested, right? Because
Really?
we're
Okay.
talking about sex, and people are really interested in sex work, whether they're judging it negatively or like kind of curious or living vicariously through us. It's a fascinating industry. So people definitely let us talk. We're doing presentations and consulting. Philanthropy tends to fall into, I think, 3 categories right now. One is, I still don't see how this affects my issue area. I require more education, or maybe I have my hands full, and we're like, okay, we build relationships, and we know that eventually they will connect the dots. And then there are groups that are like, yes, social justice, sex worker rights, absolutely. It's great to have an entity like New Moon in the room, and so we are being welcomed with open arms in various spaces, especially racial justice, LGBTQ funding spaces, stuff like that. And then there are people who have they believe that all sex work is exploitation and trafficking. And these might be feminist funds, especially like feminist funds controlled by people with more second-wave feminist values. And there's also complicated conversations there around the existence of trans identity and what is BDSM? It looks like abuse to me, and so we do talk to them because we also work with survivor groups. And so we ally and fund and work with different survivor groups around the country who are also pro-sex worker rights because they can be our translators. And they can help educate on, like, if you really want to address exploitation in the industry, you have to work with sex workers, right? Mm-hmm. So slow work, tedious work, but very rewarding. So far, so good.
Yeah.
New Moon is still a little bit of an experiment. We're very young. We're about 1.5 years old. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, how is it exactly that you're able to tap into these mainstream philanthropic organizations that aren't necessarily focused on sex worker rights?
Well, it's interesting. I have to start by saying I didn't plan any of this. I was just a pot-smoking dominatrix who was really angry about what was happening to my community. And then all of a sudden I found myself being a community organizer and then a coalition organizer and then working nationally on policy stuff. And now I'm technically in philanthropy, and it's all very surprising to me. So there's been a learning curve. But the reason New Moon exists is we have a founding anchor family foundation that wishes to remain anonymous. But they had historically invested in environmental issues. They're very disappointed with environmental crisis response, and so now they're turning their attention to other issues like fallout that's going to happen from climate crisis. So they were looking at mass migration. And they're studying mass migration and funding in that space, and then they happen to be vacationing in Jupiter, Florida, when Robert Kraft, Patriots owner from Massachusetts, gets caught getting a hand job at a massage parlor. And it's this big, it's the same thing, it's this big sex trafficking bust. The owner of the Patriots is a sex trafficker exploiting women. And so this family, and they happen to be Asian women, I forget exactly what country they're from, but it was an Asian massage parlor. And so this family foundation, the members of the family were like, oh, sex trafficking of migrant women, and they were looking at the migrant angle, and then they followed the case and they found out there was no sex trafficking going on. It was just consensual sex work, but that the women were actually at risk of being deported because they were breaking prostitution laws.
I see.
I'm so proud of them for connecting the dots and thinking, okay, these women were trying to make money. They were not from the U.S. They were engaged in migration, and now they're at risk of deportation for just trying to make a living. Who's representing them? Who's working on this issue? What is sex work? And so eventually I got connected to them and started talking to them about the issue. And they asked me, okay, they're like, we're in on sex workers' rights, especially for immigrants. Where is the funding for this coming from? And I'm like, what funding? It's like a lot of sex worker organizations are self-funded. A client might donate, or you take some of your earnings from the club or sessions and you fund your own stuff. And it's like a lot of sex worker groups operate on less than $10,000 a year. And that's changing, fortunately. But they're like, we will offer you seed funding to start a philanthropic organization. And Savannah, let's see if you can get more dollars into the movement. And so that's how we have had a springboard, to start re-granting, getting data on the field that we can bring to philanthropy spaces. And then we count as funders, which is, you want to talk about imposter syndrome, just applying to these, it's like $3,000 to get into these events. They're very inaccessible. But we're there as funders and experts on a very specific overlooked issue, and that's how we get in the door.
Tell me a little bit more about your work with especially the people on the ground, like more of the grassroots organizations and the people who are maybe really wanting to make a change and they just need a little bit more direction. How exactly are you a resource for?
So the Movement for Sex Worker Rights, which is global, we specialize in the US, but we are collaborating with other funders globally just to get data on exactly what we're talking about right now. In the US, we do have really important data point, which is we believe that the Movement for Sex Worker Rights, as far as visible grassroots organizations, has grown by 1,000% since 2015. And we got that data from, I was at SWAP USA in 2015. We had a wonderful board, and we decided to count how many sex worker-led groups we could find in the country. And we could count about 20. Maybe there was 30, but we could count about 20 visible, active ones. And now, here we are, 2024, and at New Moon, we maintain a list of sex worker-led groups and survivor-led groups that are pro-sex worker rights, but that list has exploded to over 230. And the vast majority of these groups have been active online in the past 6 months. So that shows what this toxic anti-trafficking narrative has resulted in, and things like SESTA and FOSTA, right?
Yeah.
And Backpage being taken down. Sex workers are being affected in their personal lives, and they're coming out in droves to do the destigmatization work, to try to stop bad laws and pass better ones. So the average profile of these groups, they are sex worker-led, usually a wide array of sex workers. We have escorts, content creators, pro-doms and pro-subs, strippers. It's a real mix, and they're really all in it together. Occasionally we see a specific affinity group like Strippers Are Workers in Washington when they're focusing on a specific dancer issue. And we love that because that's a legal form of sex work. They can do that. But a lot of these groups are really mixed. They have budgets of usually under $10,000, but if they do have some sort of funding, it's usually under $60,000, and largely self-funded. And they concern themselves usually with one of two activities and sometimes both. They are usually engaged in direct services, which means trying to do something to help their peers. So they do outreach and hand out condoms and safe supplies, or they host community gatherings, things like that. Or they're engaged in advocacy, which means talking to legislators, engaging the media, public education forums, and sometimes they do both. But it's a lot because they're all volunteers. There are very, very few sex worker groups where somebody can actually get compensated for all the time they put into this. So that's something we're trying to change at New Moon in our own small way. And so at New Moon, we are run for and by sex workers, and all of us on the team have worked in sex worker spaces for a long time. We've done the direct services, we've done the advocacy, and we think about when we got started, and it's like, how much more effective could we have been? How much of our time we could have saved, money we could have saved if we just had a little bit of guidance and structure and support. We're using the funding as an outreach tool because we know a $1,000 micro grant, that's not going to go real far, but it's what our fund can do right now. But they can use it to have a community dinner, or buy outreach supplies, or pay for everybody to get gas and go to the public education forum, right? But we're using it as a mechanism to also reach out and learn about them and build relationships. What are your priorities? What do you need? And so we have found that even doing that, just getting on Zoom or the phone with these groups is so appreciated because they're not operating by themselves. We can tell them about other resources that we're seeing around the country. Oh, this group over here is doing what you're doing. You guys should talk and share notes. We offer what is referred to as technical assistance. Technical assistance can be like, hey, let's help you learn how to make a budget. Oh, you think you want to start a nonprofit? That's a really big deal. Maybe you want fiscal sponsorship. Let's introduce you to some fiscal sponsors so that you can take donations and actually pay people or whatever you want to do. And so we offer a lot of technical assistance, and then we have these capacity building programs like Spokes Hub, which is mostly for individuals. We're working with groups, but then individuals can come and take a class, learn about issues like race and gender in the sex trade, or they can get hard skills like how to interview your peers for advocacy. So through that, we're trying to serve individuals, because just because you're a sex worker advocate and you want to make change doesn't mean that there's necessarily a group in your area, right? A lot of people are really isolated, so we're trying to decrease the isolation.
So if a grassroots organization wanted to link up with New Moon Network, is there usually like them reaching out to you, or are you doing like active outreach to these orgs?
We're doing both. New Moon has been a slow to reveal project, which is very unlike my usual tendency. I'm usually like, we built it, we're announcing it, we're blowing it up, we're doing it, but I have wonderful teammates who like slow me down. And also we're trying to like test our concept and make sure that our processes work. The last thing we want to do is disappoint anybody in the sex worker rights movement, and also we want to show philanthropy some real data, right? So New Moon has been quietly incubating and slowly revealing itself for the past year and a half, and our outreach has been like that too. So there's over 230 groups in the US that we can count. We would love to meet them all, but we knew that if we just sent out one big blast and said, hey, you can come apply for a grant, we'd be overwhelmed. We might not be able to service all that need, and then people might be disappointed. So we have started just tiers of outreach. We're starting with the groups that we have connections to, and then we're like, hey, could you all recommend one or two groups that we should reach out to next, and letting it organically grow from there. We don't really have a social media presence, but we let our allies talk about it, and yeah, we encourage people to apply for a micro grant or take spoke subclasses, and it's just been kind of slow and steady.
Working in more of the digital space on my end, I think that there is like a little bit of disconnect as far as, okay, well, how is the issues with in-person sex work, as an example, how is that relevant, or how does that apply to more of the online sector of adult? Could you enlighten me a little bit on how different forms of sex work are really interconnected at the end of the day, and how impacts to one sector ultimately affect another?
Absolutely, and thanks for asking that question. And I guess I'll preface it by saying that it's not something that's immediately apparent even to people who work in the adult sector, because we can get really in our, like, we can be strippers in a strip club, and we're in the strip club world, and it's like we might not know anything about BDSM dungeons or online content creation, so it's easy to get siloed. But what we're seeing in the movement for sex workers' rights, and also what's happening with attacks against our industry, is our opposition, people who tend to be maybe anti-sex or anti-sexuality, unless it's like narrowly done in a certain way, they see all of us as the same. Whether you are a content creator, whether you're a stripper, whether you are a platform provider, whether you are a photographer who shoots content for people, they see us all as engaging in antisocial, toxic behavior, and they want it to end. So right there we have the shared stigma, and we are sharing the attacks regardless of where in the industry we are. So there's that. And that, in my opinion, is an argument for kind of looking at what's happening in our various sectors and how we're being attacked, and thinking together about how we're going to push back, because there's more of us than there are of them. There's a whole lot of sex workers out there, especially with the explosion of content creation. And then there's a lot of really powerful businesses, But then as far as like the day-to-day, how these things are interconnected, a lot of people try sex work and it's not for them, or they might just do it to pay off student loans, and it's this clandestine thing. And they might just have one modality of sex work. They might dance for a little while and pay off their loans. But if somebody decides that sex work is a good fit for them, it's pretty likely, in my experience, and I think I've talked to thousands of sex workers after being in the industry for as long as I have. People tend to hop around because they want to try something new, or they sense that they might be really good at something, or they're like, I'm not a great stripper, but I'm really good at talking to people, and I think I want to try escorting because I can make so much more money, Or a client gives you their number and says, hey, I want to take care of you, you can be my sugar baby, and it's like, and then we all have platforms now because we're taking pictures all the time, and of course we're going to monetize that because sex workers are entrepreneurs, right? We're going to monetize our entire beings and our entire existence. And so and we also have, especially with the internet and social media, there's so much opportunity for us to have a broad client base. It's like I have clients who they enjoy my softer content, which is a little more girlfriend experience, but then I have a lot of pro-dom, like kinky clients, and so I have all these different versions of Savannah that I practice, and so sometimes I'm working in a dungeon, sometimes I'm working in a strip club, sometimes I'm an escort, and I'm always making content, right? And I'm monetizing all these real life experiences, and I'm not unique and I'm not alone. And I would love to see more conversation about this reality, because I love how there is more support for certain kinds of sex workers. Like we have wonderful organizations like Cupcake Girls who have taken on a pro-sex worker rights stance, and they go into strip clubs specifically and they help dancers find childcare, or maybe they're having a problem at home, or they need help moving, or peer support. Groups like Cupcake Girls are focusing on strippers. And then we have amazing groups like Pineapple Support, which are there for the content creators, right? And so we're seeing services emerge, but they tend to be segmented towards a specific kind of sex worker. I'm hoping that as this conversation evolves, that we will recognize that it's all the adult industry and people move around the sector. A lot of our clients aren't just one kind of client. Clients might buy pornography and go to a strip club, or they might see escorts, or they might go to massage parlors. So it's like our clients aren't staying in one place and the workers aren't staying in one place. So we need to be cognizant of that and understanding what the safety needs are for people. And also then just legally, it's like the adult industry is being attacked from so many different places that it's like we can't assume that we're safe just because we're operating in a certain sector. I've seen every single sector of the adult industry be attacked, whether it's a BDSM dungeon or escorting sites or online platforms. Because again, our opposition sees us as all the same, and they will do anything to undermine everything we're doing, right? And so we really are all in this together. And even just because we're operating in a legal sector of sex work, that doesn't mean that we have job security. We're operating in total precarity, in my opinion. It's like we can be able to do business one day and then something changes and you can't do business the next day. And that's affecting all of us. So I'm hoping that we can sort of keep having these conversations to understand just how interwoven this industry is.
I think, you and I have talked before, but you mentioned education is a really big piece of that. Yeah. So is that something that New Moon is helping to also facilitate?
Yeah, so in the philanthropic sector, we focus on educating around what people refer to as intersectionality, that a person doesn't have a single issue life, that our various aspects of our identity and our life experience make us affected by different social justice movements, racial justice, gender justice, all these different things. But then when we come to the adult industry, intersectionality is still important, but we're available to have similar discussions about the overlap between the different modalities, why we should care about the adult industry as a whole and not just parts of it. And so we do offer consulting services, we do panels and presentations, and we're also working with our Spokes Hub graduates so that they can also carry these messages and do their own advocacy if they wish. So we're always down to talk.
One final question for you. If someone, an individual who is engaged in sex work, if they see something and they feel compelled to make a difference, but they're really maybe unsure about how to start, what advice would you give them?
I'd say think about how you want to make a difference. Do you want to make a difference in somebody's day right now by giving them a sympathetic ear as a peer, or making them a sandwich, or helping get them access to safe sex supplies, like the tangible, make a difference right now today? Or do you want to work upstream and make a difference for the people tomorrow by changing laws? Do you want to make a difference in the everyday by educating your local community to not treat sex workers poorly and to treat us like people, humanizing us, destigmatization? These are all, and some people are called to art, which I think is also culture shifting. So think about, what are your gifts? What do you want to spend your time doing? Because you're probably not going to get paid. And start there. And then look for examples. You can contact New Moon, like who's out there doing condom distribution? I want to learn about that, Is there anybody in my area? Look locally, because again, we've had this 1,000% movement growth. Odds are good that there might be at least a small group in your region doing something, and you're always welcome to reach out to New Moon and ask about that. You can come to any of our programs we're running. Spokes Hub is where we met, which if you're an individual and you want to learn about advocacy in a peer learning environment on Zoom, we welcome you. Yeah, and then also sex workers are busy. Just you can find groups that exist only online or that might exist around the world, and they'll be hosting Zoom webinars because they're active and they're doing this work, so you can connect with them too. There's a lot going on.
Yeah. And see different examples of how even other parts of our world are organizing.
Yeah, one resource I would love to throw out there is nswp.org, and that stands for the Global Network of Sex Work Projects. And they are a global entity that has membership of sex worker orgs from around the world, So you can go on their membership directory and you can find sex worker groups operating in South Africa and Cambodia and Argentina and Canada and the US and everywhere. And it's really inspiring to go and see how they're doing it differently, because sometimes they are, and we in the US, we're great, but we're not. I mean, we have a lot to learn from our global peers about how to get shit done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Global skill sharing.
Global.
Wow.
That's the next step with Spokes Hub, is trying to work across time zones and sometimes language barriers, and also making sure people can get paid, because all of our educators get paid, our graduates get paid. People shouldn't have to do all this work for free, and so we're trying to do what we can to at least compensate people a little bit.
Savannah, thank you so much for taking the time and just imparting all of this knowledge about New Moon Network. If people are looking to gain more information about maybe how their organization can be supported, or even just learn more about New Moon Network, how can they find you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here, Vanessa. This has been really fun and rewarding, and I just so appreciate you recognizing this project. We can be found at newmoonnetwork.org. And then we do have a LinkedIn profile. So if you're into LinkedIn, you can find us there. But otherwise, we're not really on social media yet. And if people want to contact me directly, it's director@newmoonfund.org. So reach out.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you, Savannah.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa.